Madam President.
The Senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, we're hearing a lot of discussion here in Washington this week and around the country about the so-called sequester, which I think bears some explanation. We talk in terms here in Washington that oftentimes I think ordinary Americans have a hard time understanding the arcane world and the arcane lexicon that we have here in Washington, D.C. But basically, it's these spending cuts, across-the-board cuts that will take effect the end of this week. And it was a process that was put in place, many, many months ago. In fact, if you go back to the Budget Control Act, which passed in August of 2011, you won't find very many people now who will claim paternity of that idea. In fact, there's a big debate going around, a lot of finger-pointing about whose idea this was and whose fault it was that we are where we are. I would simply point out that I think, there were a lot of Republicans and Democrats who voted for the Budget Control Act. So clearly, many of us voted in support of that as a last resort. Many of us didn't want that to happen. We wanted to see a deal worked out where we would actually address what the major problems are that are facing this country with regard to our spending and our debt. But since that couldn't be negotiated between the President and leadership of Congress, we ended up with this process where we had some immediate spending cuts take effect, about $900 billion, with another $1.2 trillion to follow, hopefully achieved through reforms, tax reform, entitlement reform by a so-called super committee that met, convened for a while, but when that committee failed to reach a conclusion, it set in process, in motion, what we know today as sequester, and I guess actually it was built to go until the 1st of January, in which case all these things would take effect if nothing had happened. Clearly nothing had happened, and so when January rolled around, we ended up with this process we now know as sequester. But I want to point out, because it is, the President's been running away from this. It's like somehow this just imaginarily appeared, this idea of sequester. But if you go back and you look at the origin of this, it was clearly something the President and his people put forward. And fine point's been put on that by Bob Woodward in his book and subsequent op-ed this last weekend, in which he stated very clearly that this was an idea that originated with the White House. And in fact, Jack Lew, in his confirmation hearing before the Senate Finance Committee, actually mentioned the fact that when they were looking at something that they could use, a trigger, if you will, that they drew upon the Graham-Rudman-Hollings agreement that was agreed to back in 1985 by the Congress, and that incorporated this idea of a sequester, which was an across-the-board spending cut. And so basically it came from the White House. It came from the President and his people. The idea of sequester, that's where it originated. And so to suggest now that somehow they don't know about this, or they didn't have anything to do with it, it isn't their responsibility, is completely contradictory to the facts, and as have been delineated by Bob Woodward in his book and many others who were familiar with those discussions. But the point, very simply, Madam President, is we have a process that was put in place a long time ago. We go back to August 2011 when the Budget Control Act was passed to find out why we are where we are today. Now, the other thing that was interesting to me, which I think is now added to the narrative, or trying to sort of reconstruct the history of all this, is the idea that somehow there should have been taxes incorporated in this, that we needed to have, quote, a balanced approach in the sequester. That was never contemplated. This was all on the spending side. If you look at the history of this, and you listen actually to, again, the people who are familiar with those discussions, and Bob Woodward this weekend in his op-ed said the President is moving the goalpost. The revenues and taxes were not a part of this. But now all of a sudden, the White House is insisting upon, we want taxes to be a part of this. Well, what's ironic about that is they got taxes. They got a big, fat tax increase on January 1st of this year. And that wasn't balanced. There were no spending cuts in that. That was all taxes. $620 billion, the largest tax increase in American history. And so, from our perspective, the tax issue has been dealt with. The President got revenues that weren't contemplated by the sequester in the first place. And yet today, he gets up and argues that this needs to be a, quote, balanced plan, which it was a euphemism around here for we want more of your tax dollars. We want more of taxpayers' money to come to Washington, D.C. We want higher taxes. That is what that essentially message is saying when the President and many of his allies up here on Capitol Hill say we want a balanced plan. It means we want tax increases. Tax increases on top of the $620 billion in new taxes that the President got on January 1st of this year. Now, what's interesting to me about this whole process is it was reported this morning that the President has called a meeting on Friday. He wants to convene a meeting on Friday to talk about now these draconian cuts that are going to go into effect, and he's been traveling all over the country picking the most high-profile, highly visible items that he can that would suggest that this is going to have just this profound, dramatic impact on people around this country. And so now he's coming back to Washington. When? March 1st. What is that? It's the day the cuts are designed to go into effect. Where has the President been for the last year and a half? Madam President, where is the leadership in waiting until the very day that these cuts are supposed to go into effect to say, oh, let's have a meeting to talk about what we might be able to do to avoid the impact of these across-the-board spending reductions? Well, March 1st, okay, here we are, 11th hour, once again, the last minute, the President sweeps in and says he wants to do something to try and avert this. But, again, remember, this we have known about for a year and a half. This is not a new revelation. We've known this is coming for a very, very long time. The Super Committee failed to produce a result in November of 2011. So it's almost a year and a half now that we've known the sequester is coming. And in fact, last summer we passed legislation in Congress that asked the administration to give us some detail and some specificity about where these cuts are going to take place. And we got some vague outline about that. We didn't get any report from the President that enumerated these because, frankly, I don't think they had gone through the process of trying to figure out what they were going to do with it. And so here we are. Now, 18 months later, at the 11th hour, the President all of a sudden says, well, let's have a meeting and talk about what we might be able to do to avoid the impact of these across-the-board spending reductions. Madam President, where is the leadership in that? Why weren't we doing that 12 months ago, 11 months ago, 10 months ago, a month ago, last week? Why weren't we talking about this earlier? Why do we have to wait till the very last day to have a discussion about this? Well, evidently, the President is better at campaigning than he is at governing, because he's been driving all over the country. I shouldn't say driving, flying all over the country, over 5,000 miles. Over 5,000 miles campaigning on this issue to try and scare people into believing that an $85 billion across-the-board spending reduction, which represents 2.4% of federal spending this next year, is somehow going to be disastrous for our economy and for our country. Well, you know, frankly, I'm not in any way diminishing the impact of spending reductions. Spending reductions will have some impact. There's no question about that, for sure. But to go out and say that we're going to have 90-minute lines in airport, that we're not going to have meat inspectors, all these things that they are trying to put out there to scare the American people, to dramatize, and frankly to traumatize the American people, about a 2.4% reduction in overall federal spending. Now, if you're an average American family or an American business or anybody in this country, and you know that you're going to have a 2.4%, you have 2.4% less to work with next year, what do? Well, you sit down around your kitchen table and you figure out what those things are that you spend money on that you can live without. It's a fairly simple exercise, and in most cases, people are going to pick the low priority items. They're going to pick the things that they can probably live without. They're not going to pick the things that they really need and rely upon and depend upon. But I think most Americans would agree that they could find a 2.4% reduction in their annual spending if they had to. That's something that ordinary average Americans, I think, have to deal with all the time. Let's just tighten our belts a little bit. Let's figure out how we can how we can get along with 2.4% less spending. Well, we're talking about 2.4% less spending on a $3.6 trillion annual federal budget. Now, what does that represent? $85 billion is a lot of money. It's a lot of money anywhere. It's a lot of money in my state of South Dakota and the small town I grew up in. We didn't, those are dimensions that we didn't even, contemplate in most cases. But if you think about it this way, $85 billion, the amount of money that we are asked to reduce in terms of the overall federal spending this next year is the equivalent of how much our country borrows every single month. Every 28 days, we borrow $85 billion. So every single month, we borrow. We put on the backs of our children and grandchildren as much money as we are asking the federal government, I should say the federal government is being asked to live without for an entire year. 2.4% of annual federal spending. Now, to be fair, people are going to say, well, wait a minute, it's not 2.4 because it's just affecting a certain area of the budget. And they're right. It will represent a bigger percentage simply because so much of the budget has been walled off from this. The area where the real federal spending is, where 3/5 to 2/3 of all federal spending is, has essentially, for all intents and purposes, been protected or insulated from this. There's a small 2% cut that would occur in some of the mandatory areas of the budget. But for all intents and purposes, what really drives federal spending year in and year out, and what's going to represent, according to the Congressional Budget Office, about 91% of all federal spending 10 years from now, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, mandatory spending, entitlement programs, that's pretty much walled off. So we're shrinking increasingly the discretionary part of the budget, which represents a smaller and smaller portion of federal spending each and every year. But the reality is, it still is 2.4% out of a $3.6 trillion annual budget that we're talking about here. So, Madam President, it seems to me at least that all the hand-wringing that's going on in Washington right now and all the drama that the President's trying to create by flying over 5,000 miles across the country campaigning about the effects of this sequester really gets lost in what I think every American has to deal with every single day and every single week and every single month and every single year. And that is, sometimes they have to do with a little bit less. And maybe Washington, D.C. can figure out how to do that. But you have to ask the question again, where is the leadership? The President, Friday, March 1st, the day this happens, decides to have a meeting. We have known about this for 18 months. The United States Senate, under the leadership of the majority, the Democrats here in the Senate, hasn't passed a budget now for 1,400 days. 1,400 days without a budget. We're going on 4 years without a budget. We spend $3.5, $3.6 trillion of the American taxpayers' money every single year, and we haven't had a budget that suggests how we're going to spend that now for going on 4 years. Where is the leadership in that? The President of the United States submits a budget, which he will sometime soon. He's missed the deadline already, but we assume that's coming here in the next few weeks. But the last couple of years, the budget that he submitted to Congress, when it was voted on up here in the House and in the Senate, didn't receive a single vote. Now, perhaps not surprising that it didn't receive a Republican vote because it had a lot of tax increases in it, but it didn't get a Democrat vote. Zero. Zilch. House or Senate. There wasn't a Republican or a Democrat up here that voted for the President's budget. Why? Because it wasn't serious. The President's not doing anything to meaningfully address out-of-control spending and out-of-control debt. And so here we are. The Budget Control Act finally did put in place some spending reductions, and now everybody is hyperventilating about what we can do to avoid it. How can we turn this off? How can we shut off the sequester? Well, I frankly believe we could do this in a lot better way, a lot more responsible way when it comes to these spending reductions. We ought to do it in a way that doesn't put a disproportionate burden on the defense budget. National security represents 20% of total federal spending, but it gets 50% of the cuts under the sequester. That's not the way it ought to happen. And I'm all for, and plans have been offered, twice passed by the House Republicans, to replace this sequester with other what we believe are more responsible spending reductions. But that passed the House of Representatives, can't pass in the United States Senate. The President's had no interest in looking at some alternative. The only alternative he's interested in is the one that would do the most harm and the most damage to the American economy, and that's more taxes. And if he gets taxes on this, if he gets taxes to turn off the sequester, like the taxes he got on January 1st, it won't be enough, because it's never enough. People who believe in big government and believe that the way you solve deficits is to raise taxes are never going to raise enough revenue. If you don't address what is really afflicting our country, and that is out-of-control spending, you haven't done anything to solve the problem, which the $620 billion tax increase on January 1st demonstrated. The amount of money, the amount of revenue generated by that tax increase January 1st will fund the government this year for less than a week. Less than a single week. This isn't a revenue problem. This isn't a tax problem. This is a spending problem. And it is time for some leadership. Time for the President to quit campaigning, to come back here, and to start governing. But here we are, Friday, the day it's all set to take effect. We've got a $16 trillion debt. The Congressional Budget Office says at the end of the next 10 years it's going to be $26 trillion. We're adding $1 trillion a year. We're borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar we spend. Revenues coming into the Treasury, according to the Congressional Budget Office, are going up, actually. And by 2015 are going to be 19.1% of our entire economy, which is a percentage point, more than a percentage point, higher than the 40-year historical average. Revenues are going up, and for the next decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office, revenues will exceed by about a percentage point the 40-year historical average. So revenues are coming up to above historical averages, and yet we continue to run trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see. Well, we've got to get our spending under control. We've got to get the economy growing again. The Republican staff on the Joint Economic Committee put out a study that suggested that if we had revenue growth like we've had, average revenue growth for the past 60 years, if we'd had that in the past 4 years, that the deficits today would be half of what they are. That's the impact of economic growth. That's why growing at 1.5% to 2% isn't enough. We've got to grow at 3 to 4%. But to grow at 3 to 4%, you've got to have policies that promote growth, that allow the economy to expand. You can't keep piling on new taxes and new regulations and making it more difficult and more expensive for people who create jobs in this country to create those jobs. So the economy will continue to grow at a sluggish, anemic rate. We'll continue to have these high deficits, particularly if we don't get our spending under control. It's about exercising fiscal discipline and responsibility when it comes to our spending. It's about putting policies in place that will promote job creation and growth in this country. That's what it's going to take to get this country back on track. And yet, you know, the President's out campaigning around the country, comes back now at the 11th hour on March 1st and decides to have a meeting at the White House to talk about something we've known was going to happen now for 18 months. 18 months. And we've got the most predictable crisis, according to the Simpson-Bowles Commission, that we've ever seen. The spending and debt crisis that's in front of us, we've known about for a long time. You can see it. It's like a slow-moving train wreck out there. You're just watching it. You just know it's going to happen. And yet nobody's doing anything to turn off the engines. It's high time that we did that. I hope the President will engage. I hope that we'll get for the first time now in over, well, almost 4 years, 1,400 days, a budget in the United States Senate that puts a plan in place, a real plan, not a fake plan, not a phony plan, not a plan that has a bunch of tax increases, but a plan that actually addresses what drives federal spending and debt in a way that will put us on a more sustainable fiscal path and ensure that future generations of Americans have a higher standard of living and a higher quality of life than what previous generations have had, not a lower and a less one. And that's the path we are headed on today if we don't change course. Madam President, I yield the floor. Madam President, such the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Madam President.
Senator from Montana.
Madam President, I ask that proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 26, the nomination of Jack Lew to be Secretary of Treasury, with 8 hours for debate equally divided in the usual form, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote without intervening action or debate on the nomination. That the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. That no further motions be in order, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Under the previous order, the Senate will now proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will now report.
Nomination, Department of the Treasury, Jacob J. Lew of New York to be Secretary.
Under the previous order, there will be 8 hours of debate equally divided in the usual form.
Madam President, America's first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, once said, and I quote, "The confidence of the people will easily be gained by a good administration." This is the true touchstone. Hamilton's words take on a new prominence today as we task our next Treasury Secretary to gain the trust of the American people and restore confidence in our nation's economy. 19 of 24 senators on the Senate Finance Committee voted yesterday on a bipartisan basis in favor of Jack Lew's nomination. Senators on both sides of the aisle spoke to his character and to his integrity. He is well qualified to be the nation's next Treasury Secretary and will work to build the people's confidence and restore trust and certainty in both our government and in our economy. That will be his touchstone. I'm certainly not alone in supporting Mr. Lew for the crucial role as the administration's top advisor on economic policy. Yesterday's overwhelming support for Mr. Lew came after one of the most thorough reviews of any candidate for the position, a process that included hours of interviews with Mr. Lew, the examination of 6 years of tax records, and more than 700 questions for the record. In comparison, the committee asked Secretary Geithner 289 questions, Secretary Paulson 81, and Secretary Snow 75 questions. Mr. Lew has met personally with more than 40 senators since being nominated for Treasury Secretary last month, answering questions and addressing any concerns. Throughout the confirmation process, Mr. Lew has been open and transparent. And, as I hope a vote here in this Senate will soon show, he has gained the trust and the confidence of many in this chamber. Mr. Lew has a long and distinguished career focused on public service, with experience in both academia and on Wall Street. Most recently, he was the White House Chief of Staff. He has also served as Budget Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the current administration and under President Clinton, where, I'll note, he helped guide our nation through one of the greatest periods of economic growth in America's history. Mr. Lew has also served in the U.S. Department of State as Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources. Mr. Lew has demonstrated time and again that he has the experience and knowledge to help get the nation's economy back on track. We need a strong man at the helm and to help tackle the many fiscal challenges facing our nation, and I believe Jack Lew is that man. Just 2 days from now, on March 1, across-the-board budget cuts known as the sequester will hit. $85 billion in federal spending will be sliced from thousands of programs, including Medicare, rural development, and early education. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office predicts the cuts could slow the economic recovery and result in another year of sluggish growth and high unemployment. I firmly believe we need to cut our debt and get our fiscal house in order. We know there are places to trim the fat. The American public knows that, certainly. But we need to take a scalpel to waste and inefficiency, not allow a hatchet to hack into American jobs. Our economy will be put to the test again in just weeks when the continuing resolution expires on March 27th. we face the threat of a government shutdown. And on the horizon, federal borrowing limit will be reached in late May. That will require another extension of the debt ceiling. Madam President, this is no way to run a country. Congress has been lurching from one fiscal showdown to the next, leaving the nation with uncertainty. And the only way to be able to get past these budget battles is by working together. We all know that. We just have to just start doing it. Republicans, Democrats, members of the House and the Senate, we need to work together to put in place policies that create more jobs and spark economic growth. It's deeds, not words. There have been enough words around here about working together. We've got to start actually performing the deeds and working together. And we'll need to work with Mr. Liu and with the administration to put the nation's economy back on track. We have to get off this roller coaster of a ride. It's like a yo-yo. We can't, there's no stability. There's no certainty. Going from one fiscal crisis to the next is undermining our economy. To give families and businesses certainty, we must agree on a balanced, comprehensive plan to cut the debt that includes both revenue and spending cuts. The math will not work any other way. A long-term balanced plan will bridge the budget battles and make real progress towards solving our deficit problem. A balanced plan will also encourage businesses to invest, enable investors to return to the markets with confidence, and most importantly, put Americans back to work in a growing economy. That's the bottom line. More jobs, more good-paying jobs. We need more certainty and predictability so that businesses hire and people spend to get those good-paying jobs. Over the past 2 years, I had a standing weekly call with Treasury Secretary Geithner. Every week, we'd get the phone. It was 9:45 on Wednesdays. And about once a month, we'd personally, physically get together just to go over things. No matter where we were or what we were doing, we'd always try to pick up the phone once a week to check in. I must tell you, Madam President, it was on the minute, 9:45. Neither of us, each of us knew the other was going to be there. Secretary Geithner and I grew to become friends and really trust each other. Families started having dinner together. We do things together. It's that trust and confidence that is so necessary, and which is necessary to begin working together to make things happen. The conversations proved invaluable as we worked to overcome numerous economic challenges. I continue the outreach of Mr. Liu and have been having a standing weekly call with him in anticipation that he'd soon be Treasury Secretary. And I'm going to keep it up. And I know he wants to too. It's very heartening, frankly. He has been very open and receptive and is eager to work with all of us here in the Congress, to strengthen America's economy and create more jobs. He wants to do a good job. He knows he must talk with us and communicate with us in order to do that. Working together will be key to promoting economic growth and stability. Now, if confirmed by the Senate today, one of Mr. Liu's first acts as Treasury Secretary will be affixing his signature to all new Federal Reserve notes. I'm not sure if people will be able to read his loopy signature. It's an inside joke that sometimes people have a hard time reading his handwriting. But anyway, his signature will be on his Federal Reserve notes, and that loopy signature is described as looking more like a stretched out slinky than a name. But that's Mr. Liu. That's who signed. But Mr. Liu promised the President that if confirmed, he will work to make at least one letter legible in order to not deface America's currency. And we will hold him to that promise. But in addition to the signature of America's Treasury Secretary, the front of every U.S. dollar bill has a seal of the United States Treasury. Look closely, and you will see the symbols of balancing scales that represent justice. There is a chevron containing 13 stars, which represent the 13 original colonies. And underneath the emblem is a key, which notes Treasury's official authority. If confirmed, we will be entrusting Mr. Liu with the authority to oversee America's financial system and economic policy. He will play a critical role in the upcoming debates on spending priorities and tax policy. We will be relying on him to ensure our government and finances are sound. We will be asking him to work with us to return some stability and confidence to our economy. We will be asking him to work with us to ensure the United States remains a great world power in this competitive global economy. It is a great responsibility he has, one in which I believe Mr. Liu will live up to. Madam President, 224 years ago, this body, the United States Senate, approved the first cabinet position for this young nation when they unanimously approved Alexander Hamilton to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. I ask my colleagues to confirm Mr. Liu today to the nation's 76th Treasury Secretary so he can get to work and help strengthen our economy. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I rise today to speak on the nomination of Mr. Jacob Liu to be Secretary of the Treasury. Now, this is really an important nomination. With our still struggling economy and our growing fiscal problems, the next Treasury Secretary is going to have a lot on his plate. That being the case, we've worked on the Finance Committee to vet Mr. Liu, to examine his background and credentials, and provide a complete picture of his qualifications for this post. I would like to offer a few comments about our review process, what we learned, and the reservations about the nominee that remain with me now that this process is complete. Madam President, let me begin by saying a few words about the process itself. For well over a decade, the Finance Committee has followed a specified procedure when considering executive branch nominations. Sadly, that procedure was not followed in the case of Mr. Liu. After publicly announcing Mr. Liu's nomination, the White House waited 26 days before submitting any of his paperwork. That was an atypically long delay and in addition slowed the vetting process. It ensured that Mr. Liu would not be confirmed in time to prevent a vacancy at the Treasury Department. A nomination hearing was scheduled to be held only 12 calendar days after the paperwork was received, even though the nominee had not yet answered all of the questions that were submitted to him. That is simply not the way our process has worked in the past, and the undue haste seriously hampered our ability to thoroughly examine Mr. Liu's background and his qualifications. Once the hearing was completed, as is customary, members of the Finance Committee submitted written anonymous administration sources have decried the very notion that members of the Finance Committee had the audacity to ask hundreds of questions of Mr. Liu as part of their constitutional advice and consent responsibilities. Madam President, let me be clear. I will vigorously defend the right of any member of Congress, regardless of party, to ask questions of nominees until they are satisfied that they have obtained all the relevant information, and especially in the case of a Treasury Secretary, which is one of the most important assignments in our government today, and always has been. We go all the way back to the time of Alexander Hamilton, and we know what he meant to this country in establishing the financial system of this country. And he was Secretary of Treasury. In the case of Mr. Liu, there were several reasons why he ended up being asked numerous questions. First, the nomination process, as I mentioned, was abbreviated due to the haste of the administration. That meant the questions which in the ordinary course of business could have been resolved through discussion had to be asked in written form. Second, due to the general unresponsiveness of the administration to requests for information over the last few years, there's a pent-up demand for information and any semblance of responsiveness from the executive branch. Third, Mr. Liu's responses to many questions have been opaque. He has dissembled often. That being the case, it seemed that the only way to get answers to straightforward questions was to continue to ask for clarifications in an attempt to break through the wall of obfuscation that Mr. Liu had constructed. I have no doubt that he could have answered most of these questions in much less numerical form than he did. Even after extensive questioning, there remain several serious concerns with Mr. Liu's background, his lack of responsiveness, and the evasive manner in which he answered many questions that were posed to him. Unfortunately, many of these concerns will go unaddressed, as Mr. Liu seems to be following the standard stonewalling strategy used by so many officials in this administration, in the Obama administration. For years now, administration officials have gone out of their way to be unresponsive to information requests from Congress, and that is simply unacceptable. Far too often, legitimate inquiries submitted to the executive branch go unanswered for months at a time. Requested deadlines are discarded. Indeed, in some instances, information requests are ignored entirely. When responses are given, substantive and direct questions are given meaningless political answers. This has gone on far too long, and it has to stop. Mr. Liu, for his part, has promised me that he would be responsive to inquiries submitted by members of Congress. While his answers to questions throughout the confirmation process give me reasons to doubt his commitment to being responsive, I intend to hold him to that promise moving forward. And I believe he's an honorable man, and I believe he will try to do this. Now, Madam President, I would like to take a few minutes to address some additional substantive concerns I have about Mr. Liu, his background, and his qualifications for his post, and that have been raised. Let's consider Mr. Liu's Citigroup years. At Citigroup, Mr. Liu was managing director and chief operating officer of two units, Global Wealth Management and Citigroup Alternative Investments. Mr. Liu has claimed repeatedly that while managing, directing, and operating those Citigroup units, he essentially undertook backroom operations like firing people, moving office space, integrating computer systems, eliminating redundancies, and things of that nature. Mr. Liu has also repeatedly stated that he did not design financial products at Citigroup or make portfolio decisions or, in his words, opine on investments. In fact, when asked about investment products that were marketed and sold by the Citigroup units that he oversaw, he could not remember any specific details. It has to be noted that some of those investments ended up generating enormous losses for investors. For example, funds called MAT, ASTA, and Falcon, which were marketed, sold, and managed by the Citigroup units that Mr. Liu oversaw, ended up being the subject of lawsuits and successful arbitration claims where success was based on investors convincing arbitrators that the funds were misrepresented and mismanaged by Citigroup. The losses to investors from these funds numbered in the billions. In fact, some financial advisors at Citigroup protested internally that the misrepresented securities caused enormous damage to Citi's reputation. One of Mr. Liu's bosses at Citigroup argued on behalf of investors and against Citi's stock price and bottom line by saying that the investors had been wronged and should be made whole. She was subsequently fired. From all information I have seen, Mr. Liu did not similarly stand up for wronged investors while on Wall Street. Perhaps that is because he did not know what was going on in the firm, or at his firm. We don't really know. Despite the fact that the funds in question led to probably the largest losses in the history of the units that Mr. Liu oversaw, Mr. Liu claims that he cannot recall anything about them. If you ask anyone familiar with the funds and controversy surrounding them, they will tell you that you would have to have been away on a deserted island to not have heard about the problems that these funds faced. Yet once again, Mr. Liu continues to deny having any memory of them. But at the same time, Mr. Liu claims that while he was at Citigroup, he learned a lot about financial markets and the dangers of risk. Indeed, he cited his experience at Citi as a qualification to be Treasury Secretary, even though he appears to have little recollection about any of the actual details of his work at that time, or at least his financial details. The question remains, how could Mr. Liu operate, manage, and direct units and also be in charge of staffing decisions without having any knowledge of the financial products that were marketed, sold, and managed by these very same units? It remains unclear. Had there been a traditional vetting process, perhaps we could have gotten to the bottom of this mystery. As it is, we are only left to speculate, as you can see. In addition to Mr. Liu's lack of knowledge about some of the high-profile failures of the units he was overseeing, there are legitimate concerns relating to his compensation while at Citigroup. On January 29, 2009, President Obama made remarks about Wall Street saying that institutions were, quote, teetering on collapse, and they are asking for taxpayers to help sustain them, unquote. The President also remarked on Wall Street bonuses at the time, saying, quote, that is the height of irresponsibility. It is shameful, unquote. About Wall Street executives, he said that, quote, there will be a time for them to get bonuses. Now is not the time, unquote. Elsewhere, he referred to Wall Street bonuses as, quote, obscene, unquote. In late 2008 and early 2009, American taxpayers provided over $45 billion, that's with a B, in direct assistance to Citigroup and backed hundreds of billions of Citigroup assets. At the same time, in January 2009, Mr. Liu reportedly received over $940,000 of compensation, most of which was a bonus for work performed in 2008 when Citi was on the verge of collapse. The bonus came a day before Citi received yet another infusion of billions of dollars of taxpayer money to prop the company up. That was the day before Citigroup received the infusion of billions of dollars that he got that bonus. There is at the very least a contradiction between the President's rhetoric with regard to Wall Street and his decision to appoint Mr. Liu to be Treasury Secretary. However, rather than acknowledging any such contradiction, Mr. Liu has simply and repeatedly told us all that his compensation was in line with what other similarly situated executives received. As I've said before, that justification seems a bit like saying, gee, Dad, everyone was doing it. Unfortunately, that type of reasoning is exactly what led to the financial crisis. In addition, an employment agreement that Mr. Liu had with Citigroup had a clause stating that his guaranteed incentive and retention award would not be paid upon his exit from Citigroup. However, there was an exception indicating that he would receive that compensation, quote, as a result of his acceptance of a full-time high-level position with the United States government or regulatory body, unquote. It remains unclear how this exception is consistent with President Obama's efforts to, in his own words, close, quote, close the revolving door that carries special interest influence in and out of the government, unquote. And of course, as has been widely reported during the course of our vetting process, we found that while he was at Citigroup, Mr. Liu actively chose to invest in a hedge fund that served as a venture capital-like fund that invested primarily overseas. The fund that Mr. Liu invested in was based in the Cayman Islands at the infamous Ugland House that so many Democrats have viciously decried as a tax haven. In fact, in 2008, while campaigning for president, then Senator Obama said that the Ugland House was, quote, either the biggest building in the world or the biggest tax scam in the world, unquote. Throughout the 2012 campaign, President Obama repeatedly attacked Mitt Romney for having funds invested in the Caymans. And if I recall it correctly, Mitt Romney's funds were in a trust that he had no control over. In making such investments, Governor Romney was, in the words of the Obama campaign, betting against America. One can only wonder whether, while serving as White House Chief of Staff for President Obama, Mr. Liu supported this line of attack. Once again, Mr. Liu has repeatedly refused to acknowledge any contradiction or hypocrisy between the President's rhetoric and his own actions, defending himself only by saying that this investment was done legally and transparently. I think the same probably could have been said about Governor Romney's investment as well, that was in a blind trust. The contrast between the President's past vilification of certain financial activities and individuals and Mr. Liu's very participation in those activities is striking. Yet we are now essentially being told that people should do as administration's officials say, not as they did. Now, in addition to concerns about Mr. Liu's record, I have serious disagreements with him when it comes to policy. For example, in response to written questions, Mr. Liu backtracked from the administration's previous position on the need for entitlement reform. At one time, common sense reforms like raising the Medicare eligibility age were on the table for the Obama administration. Such ideas have apparently been discarded by the President, and Mr. Liu has made it clear that he shares that discarding position. As a Social Security and Medicare trustee, the Treasury Secretary cannot simply wish away the problems with our entitlement programs. If he's confirmed, and I believe he will be, Mr. Liu will be tasked with addressing these problems. Sadly, it appears that he'll be just another voice in the Obama administration against taking meaningful action on entitlements and in favor of higher taxes, a repetitive theme that at least all of us Republicans are getting very sick of. And the use of the word balance, my gosh, what a perversion. Madam President, I think I've made my concerns about the Liu nomination very clear. That being said, I've always believed that whoever's president, including our current president, who I like, any president, really, regardless of party, is owed a certain degree of deference when choosing people to work in his administration. Therefore, though I personally would have chosen a different person for this position, I intend to vote in favor of Mr. Liu's confirmation. Obviously, my vote in favor of Mr. Liu comes with no small amount of reservation. And I don't fault any of my colleagues for choosing to vote against him. Indeed, I share many of their same concerns. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Liu has promised to be responsive to members of Congress and their requests for information. I expect him to be responsive to the Senate Finance Committee and to the Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee as well as the Democrats. He has also promised to work in a bipartisan manner to address the problems facing our nation. I believe that Mr. Liu can and hopefully will do that. My hope is that he does not view these promises as merely boxes checked off on the way to confirmation. Madam President, if confirmed, Mr. Liu will be the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States and not the Secretary of the Obama Treasury, although indirectly he will be. His first job is the United States of America, and he might have to argue strenuously against some of the administration or the White House positions on financial matters and Treasury matters. He has to work for all of the American people and not simply one political party. If he does those things, I will be willing to work with him all the way. And I have to say, I expect him to. I expect him to be the honorable man that he has told me he is, and that I believe him to be. Otherwise, I couldn't vote for him, especially under these circumstances. However, I have to say that if he fails to live up to the promises he's made, if he becomes just another Obama acolyte using his high-powered position in the administration to attack political opponents, I will personally be sorely disappointed and hurt by it. And if that ends up being the case, he will have no greater adversary in the Senate. I don't want to be an adversary. I want to help him turn this country around. I want to be an asset to him up here. And I want him to be an asset to our country down there and up here when he comes up. Now, given my many reservations, concerns about Mr. Liu, I hope that he and the President take note that I am bending over backwards to display deference to the President's choice of Treasury Secretary. This gesture, I hope, will not be in vain. Now, I can contrast Mr. Liu's positions when he worked in the Clinton administration. Many Republicans felt that he was a straight-up guy, and I was one of them. And I've suggested to him that we would like to see that type of a person manage our Treasury rather than the partisan person that we've seen in the last couple of years. True, the position he had at the White House was a partisan position, and I make great allowance for that. I personally like this man. I personally believe he's a good man. But I also believe that sometimes we can get so caught up in politics that we don't do what we really know we should do. I'm hoping he will. I believe he will. And if he does, he's going to have a lot of support from me. I want to thank my chairman of the committee. He's always been very honorable and very straightforward. And I understand a lot of the pressures that he has had throughout this process, having been chairman a number of times myself in the Senate with various presidents. So I just want everybody to know that this is an important position. This is an important human being, and I hope he lives up to all that he has the capacity to live up to. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, two matters. First, I ask consent that the following staff of the Finance Committee be allowed the Senate floor for the remainder of the 2013 calendar year. Melanie Reiner, Eric Hansen, Swarna Velarupali, Anderson Hyman, Tyler Evilsizer, Aaron Choa, Elizabeth Karen, and Peter Sokolov.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'd like to take a moment to speak on another topic that's very important to me. That's Montana and our nation, and that's our veterans. The Veterans Jobs Caucus has organized a day of action today to draw attention to veterans' unemployment, and I am very proud to help shine a light on it. Jobs must be our #1 priority. There's no better place to start than with our veterans. With the war in Iraq coming to an end and Afghanistan winding down, we have a responsibility to make sure every single one of these men and women returns home to a paycheck, not an unemployment check. I urge my colleagues to join me in declaring war on veterans' unemployment. Let's work together to make sure every American veteran has the good-paying job that they deserve. I yield the floor.
Who yields time? If no one yields time, time will be charged equally to both sides.